Welcome back to our Washington, D.C. studio. We have a special interview, a very special interview, this time with Marsha Coleman-Adeayo.
Yes.
She is the author of a new book, No Fear, and well known because of your role as a whistleblower at the EPA in its work in South Africa. Your story inspired not only the empathy and sympathy of others who were in that situation, but actual congressional legislation with the No Fear Act that was passed in 2002. Can you tell us a little bit how this story started to unfold, and then we'll work up to the present?
Certainly. Thank you for having me. The story is really a story about the contradictions within the United States government. There's a contradiction of the way things are supposed to be, and then there's the reality of how the United States government is basically very business-oriented. And so I started working at the EPA in 1990 as a senior policy analyst. And my job was to liaison between the EPA initially and UN organizations.
And just for our viewers around the world, the EPA is the Environmental Protection Agency.
The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, which is a branch of the a branch of the federal government that focuses on environmental matters. And my job, particularly the subject of my book, deals with the fact that I was the EPA representative to the U.S. South Africa Binational Commission. This is the commission that was organized right after Nelson Mandela became president in South Africa to allow the United States government to have diplomatic relationships, technical relationships with the new government of South Africa. And so I was asked to take on the role of being the liaison from the EPA to the White House, to the South African government, to assist them in providing technical assistance to the new South Africa government. As you can imagine, I was delighted. I was, in many ways, happy about this because I was an anti-apartheid activist. I had marched in front of the South African embassy for 2 years, along with my colleagues in the Southern Africa Support Project, to free Nelson Mandela from prison. And now I was given this incredible opportunity to actually participate in the building of the new South Africa.
Let's just help our viewers frame that, because it's been a while since those events. And in 1988, even as late as 1988, the Reagan administration was describing the ANC, the African National Congress, and Nelson Mandela as notorious terrorists. And now here we are, just a few years later.
Right.
Black majority rule, at least in the political sense, has come to South Africa. Mm-hmm. The U.S. government is reaching out to South Africa. The EPA is going to South Africa, presumably to help South Africans restore environmental conditions.
And what we found was devastation. I mean, we found utter and complete devastation of the environment because the old apartheid regime had cared nothing at all about black people. They were just to be used to undergird the wealth of white South Africans. And so when I first got to South Africa as the liaison for this project, what we found were just massive poverty and massive environmental devastation. For example, in the township of Alexandra, that had hundreds of thousands of people living there, many parts did not have running water. Many parts did not have a solid waste disposal system. So that when rains would come, literally the water would seep into the shelter that these people had built, and that there was cholera and dysentery. And children, particularly the young and the old, would die from these diseases. There was a cemetery not too far where people could actually carry their dead in Alexandra. And people would carry their babies and their elderly and just put a marker on the grave. Mm. It was that much devastation. So that the townships were really concentration camps. They were what I would have called death camps in South Africa. It was my job to work with the new South Africa government to try to turn that around.
And there was, of course, in South Africa, as there was in much of the colonized and semi-colonized world, a great focus by Western powers on extraction industries, on mining in particular.
Right.
And your work took you to the issue of mining and the effects of mining and particular kinds of mining. Can you explain that?
Well, it wasn't supposed to, quite frankly. It was actually quite an accident that I found out about the whole mining problem. Because our job, as it was carved out, was fairly sanitized. I was supposed to look at waste disposal and clean water and that sort of thing, which are all obviously very important issues. But mining was certainly not on the table. And so as a part of a study tour that I developed, there was a young environmental expert named Jacob Nkukani, and he was a member of COSATU, which is the Congress of South African Trade Unions. And he approached me and said, have you heard about this community about 2 hours from Pretoria that a U.S. multinational has endangered their lives? That this U.S. multinational has mining practices that are endangering the lives of these people. Well, I hadn't heard about it, and I think that wasn't by accident. And he talked about vanadium pentoxide, which I wasn't familiar with. Vanadium
is a strategic mineral.
According to the CIA, vanadium is a strategic mineral. Why? Because a Western society is built on an infrastructure of steel, whether it's our television cameras or pacemakers or forks and spoons or airplanes or trucks. The steel that we use in this country most likely have vanadium pentoxide in it, and 80% of that vanadium pentoxide is coming from South Africa.
So it's a key artery in terms of the mineral supply for modern industrial economy is vanadium.
Well, the Ford Foundation, about 10 years before I found out about vanadium, had actually written a book called South Africa Time Running Out, and had identified vanadium as a strategic mineral that is worthy of the United States government going to war in order to make sure we had unfettered access to it.
So it wasn't just a source of commercial profit, it was also a matter for intelligence communities and for the state in terms of securing access to such a strategic mineral.
Vanadium is in the smart bombs that we use to bomb Afghanistan. It's in the smart bombs that we used in Iraq. It is in military equipment. So our military would come to a grinding halt if we didn't have access to vanadium pentoxide.
It's so interesting because few people have ever even heard of vanadium.
Right.
And you were there in South Africa, presumably for other tasks. Someone told you about this community where vanadium mining was taking place, and what happened next?
Well, what happens is I go to my supervisor, which I was supposed to do, and say, I'm hearing stories from South Africa about a U.S. multinational corporation that's mining this stuff, and by the way, it's injuring South Africans in the process. And what do you want me to do? And let me just tell you that happens quite frequently in the work that I did in terms of international relations, where we run into a problem. And generally what happens is, your supervisor or someone will say, okay, why don't you go on the phone, talk to some high-up person and say, look, can you sort of ratchet this thing down? Or how are we supposed to work together on this to make sure this doesn't become a major problem? That's what I had expected to happen. But that wasn't what happened in this situation. What happened in this situation is I was told to shut up.
You had crossed a red line that you didn't know you were crossing.
I had crossed the third rail that I had no idea that I was crossing. By the way, most whistleblowers don't know when they're crossing that line. You just sort of trip upon an issue, and before you know it, your whole world has been turned upside down.
Because you're a person of conscience. You're there to do good. You're not there looking out after the interests of multinational mining companies. You're there to try to help in terms of the situation in South Africa, in terms of environmental standards, environmental conditions. So when mine
was even a little bit more than that.
Okay.
Because I'm a political scientist. I have a PhD in political science from MIT, and I'm an Africanist by profession. I studied Africa. That is my specialization. And so when they asked me to take on this position, I went to my supervisor and said, I understand U.S. foreign policy in Africa. I'm not some little naive 18-year-old running around here. I understand U.S. foreign, and I understand that we've been on the wrong side of history in our relationship with Africa. You have to assure me that you will not place me in a position where I will be asked to harm Africa or Africans or South Africans in any way. If not, I will not take on this position. And I was given assurance by my supervisor that I would never be placed in that position.
And in fact, the opposite did happen.
And in fact, the opposite happened.
What did happen?
Well, what happened was after I was told to shut up, I became curious as to why I was being given such an unusual order. And in fact, what I was told to do was to decorate my office. She said, you know, you've got this beautiful new office. Why don't you spend your time, rather than worrying about all these difficult issues, decorating? And I thought that was just ludicrous, obviously, and I knew that they were hiding something. I wanted to know, what were they hiding? And I was able, through the Gore and Becky mechanism, to have a resolution passed which authorized the United States government to conduct an independent investigation of vanadium poisoning. This was a resolution coming out from a presidential commission.
The Gore and Becky Commission was the BNC.
Was the binational U.S. South Africa Binational Commission, affectionately called the Gore and Becky Commission,
right?
Because Vice President Gore and Deputy President Thabo Mbeki at the time were the leaders of this commission.
So the commission passed a resolution to investigate.
Exactly. And so when I tried to carry out my assignments, I was stymied in every single way. And finally, I was just told that it wasn't going to happen. I kept continuing to really press, because my information from South Africa is that people were dying and becoming ill. And that had to be a concern for someone who's in environmental protection. And so finally, we were able to get the agency to authorize a doctor to go to South Africa to at least provide preliminary intelligence on what was going on in South Africa.
Meaning the health effects for the
vanadium,
miners and their families and their communities.
From vanadium pentoxide. And I was promised that if the doctor came back and said that there was a problem, then at that point it was the independent investigation was on the table again. And so as I was sort of filling out the paperwork and making sure everything was prepared for this doctor to go to South Africa, I called him to just sort of get a sense of the scope of his methodology and the work he would do. And when I asked him, what kind of doctor are you? What is your specialization? I received, the biggest surprise ever, because I found out that he wasn't a medical doctor after all. He was a veterinarian.
Oh, my goodness. So then it became
obvious.
Clear to you you didn't start off from a position of naivete. You had studied Africa, the history of U.S. and European roles, and so you suspected there was a cover-up or a disguising of what the real issue was.
Right,
under the pretext of an investigation, this doctor clearly wasn't qualified.
And he said so. He said, I'm not a medical doctor. I don't study humans. I'm going to take some cow milk samples. My work will not be extrapolated to human health. So, of course, at that point, I raised hell inside the agency. And the answers I got were very instructive. You said you wanted a doctor? We gave you a doctor. So stop complaining. So at that point, I understood that the agency had absolutely we weren't operating on a basis of good faith at all, that the investigation would never take place.
Now, in 2002, Congress passed the Whistleblowers Act based on the inspiration from the No Fear Coalition and the work and your own story. So you became a whistleblower.
Yes.
And what whistle did you blow? What were you trying to do?
I blew two whistles. The first whistle I blew was on the issue of maltreatment in the workplace, because as an African-American woman, I had been called every kind of racial name you can possibly think of, just in the course of doing my job. I mean, they would call me just absolutely horrible names that I can't possibly repeat on television. When I started objecting to being called these kinds of names, I was told that, if you want a career here, you just have to button up and just shut up about these things. And of course, that just wasn't a part of who I was. Sure. And so I kept pushing against it. I wasn't used to being treated like that. And so I blew the whistle. I followed.
And was there a second, in addition to how you were being treated as a person?
Right.
What was the second area?
I blew the whistle on vanadium poisoning and the fact that the EPA decided not to carry out its mandated obligations under the Gore and Becky Commission. And I should also tell you that it wasn't just the name calling. I was the victim, the recipient of death threats. I was the recipient of rape threats. So my life was really turned upside down for a very long time.
A complete shock in a way, given the fact that you went there with an optimism that something good would happen. You had an assurance from your superiors that you wouldn't do anything to harm the people of South Africa. In fact, you would be a guarantor in some ways of their interests.
Right. Well, that was the point. I mean, that was, in fact, the point. The point was that at the beginning of the South African Revolution, the United States government wanted to put my face on that. They wanted the face of an African American, particularly an African American woman, I would think, to show the South Africans that they had people in government who would be sympathetic to their plight. But in fact, they were really using me as a Trojan horse. They had a set of policies that they really wanted to implement, but they couldn't come out of the gate with those policies, the private sector initiatives, selling South Africa all kinds of trinkets and different kinds of things. And so what they did was to sweeten the pot a little bit by having me as sort of the cover of the picture. And that worked, I think, initially because I had absolutely extraordinary relationships with the new South African government. It was when the government decided that they wanted to use me to do really horrible things in South Africa. And at that point, I said, no, I will not be used like this.
I want to hold up your book, if I could. It's No Fear, A Whistleblower's Triumph Over Corruption and Retaliation in the EPA, an important book, a recently released book, and I hope people get a chance to read it fully. I think that you combine sort of different elements of this story. There's the story of South African freedom, the story of multinational corporations retaining their same position in South Africa after the end of the racist apartheid rule.
Right.
The role of the United States government as a facilitator of those interests, the role of the United States government's own intelligence agencies' efforts to secure U.S. positioning, and then the struggle that you had against retaliation. Let's just talk for a second about how you were retaliated against later, and then the lawsuit that you filed.
Well, the retaliation was vicious. Once you take a stand within the United States government, I think a stand of principle and a stand of justice, at that point you become a target. You become a target, and all the power and the resources that are usually arrayed against countries that the United States government sees as enemies is now arrayed against you as an individual.
That has to be one of the most daunting possible positions for any individual to be in. I mean, it's the most powerful government in the world, and you are an individual.
And you're just a small person, right, with limited resources, limited money. And in fact, even your own tax money is now being used against you because they're hiring lawyers to fight against you. But not only that, it's daunting because this is a country that has a long history of bloody relationships, both inside of this country. If you look at the civil rights movement, overseas, if you look at the countries that have been the target of U.S. imperial interests. And so to have all of that energy arrayed against one person is terrifying.
But you were one of those rare examples where, even though your victory is not complete, you did achieve something.
Yes.
You fought back and you achieved something. What happened? What did you
Well,
achieve?
I fought back. What I did was I had a strong family, first of all, and second of all, I organized because, I'm a political scientist and I'm also an organizer. And I understood some critical ways that people change societies, which is through the organization, because I'm a child of the civil rights movement. And my grandmother was a leader in the civil rights movement. So I saw her organizing. I saw my mother organizing. So I understood something about organizing. So I started organizing. I organized a group called the No Fear Coalition. And we became an in-your-face activist group within the United States government, where we decided to challenge the United States government and its policies.
And you were U.S. government employees?
We were all U.S. government employees.
It's an amazing story.
It's an amazing story. Now, you know, there are casualties in any battle, and we lost people. There are people who died who were members of our group. One woman, Patricia Lawson, also EPA, literally died at her desk. The retaliation was so brutal that at some point her body just gave up. We lost a number of very important people. A lot of people developed very serious chronic illnesses. A lot of people developed illnesses that deal with stress. I mean, this was a battle. This was war, quite frankly. And we were a ragtag group fighting the United States government. But through it all, we did prevail. We actually organized thousands of federal workers because the retaliation is so across the board in the United States government. The discrimination is so across the board that we were able to organize thousands of federal employees who decided, you know, you can take my job, you can take my home, you can take my health benefits, but you do not have a right to my dignity. You do not have a right to my dignity. And so we organized these people, and then we, I think, tapped into the imagination of the American people that we're bigger than this, we're better than this. We don't have to be bullies, either overseas or inside the government. And we were able to enlist the help of both Democrats and Republicans. I mean, one of the most right-wing Republicans, F. James Sensenbrenner from Wisconsin, became our champion, as well as left-leaning Democrat Sheila Jackson Lee. So that combination became very dynamic inside of Congressional Hill. And we passed the first civil rights and whistleblower law of the 21st century, which is the No Fear Law, which protects whistleblowers throughout the federal government.
And I want to just step back. We only have a few minutes. The time flies. But in terms of you had mentioned that your life had been threatened too.
Yeah.
Can you say just what happened with that?
Yeah. Sitting at my desk, the phone rings, and I get a phone caller saying, you know, don't be surprised when you go to your car and you put your foot on the pedal and you get a big bang. I used to be escorted to my car by security at night. My husband and I had the same cell phones. It was one of those, we had his and her cell phones at one point, but the old ones were like the walkie-talkie looking ones. And one day he picks up my cell phone, and I had saved this one threatening call that was so horrible. It was about how this man was going to rape me, and he went into great detail. It's actually in my book. And my husband heard it. And my husband was in the military in Nigeria, so he's heard foul language before, as most military men have heard. And when he heard this, he dropped the phone. He said, my God. So I never knew when I walked down the hall or when I went into the ladies' room, whether whoever that was on the end of the phone was going to follow me. And I lived like that, I guess, for almost 2 or 3 years.
You know, you have undoubtedly, and as you can see from the back of your book, you have a preface or an introduction written by Noam Chomsky. You have a very positive response from Ralph Nader, Randall Robinson, who wrote about reparations and the issues in Africa, Glenn Ford, a wide array of notable people who you have sort of catalyzed into support for you, and I think this is the point that Noam Chomsky made, that it's part of a broader sort of grassroots, bottom-up sort of social movement in defense of government employees who dare to tell the truth, dare to follow their conscience, and then may endure what you're endured.
Well, look at Bradley Manning. I mean, you know, you look at the people who have stepped forward inside the government to say, we will not mask your lies any longer. You know, we will not pretend as though, you know, we're part of one big happy family, because there's injustice going on inside of these doors. And so what we've been able to do, I think, is just to peel back the levels of deceit so that people are able to understand when the United States government starts making noise about going to war, that maybe there's something else behind those threats. Maybe it's not just simply that they're concerned about a nuclear threat, that maybe there's some other things like oil or other kinds of natural resources that the United States government is really targeting. And so we have, I think the whistleblowers have played an invaluable role in this country. And I just wanted to play my part in writing this book and to ask not only American citizens, but people throughout the world, be careful when the United States government is saying it's giving you a present. Because we don't often give presents without something behind the ribbon. And that's particularly true in Africa as well as the Middle East and Central America. So I just wanted to add my voice to that chorus.
Let me ask you one final question. Clearly, you were victorious. Noam Chomsky says most people who file lawsuits, only 2 or 3% actually succeed. You did succeed, and then this amazing bipartisan coalition that passed the No Fear Act, the Whistleblowers Act in 2002. And yet, Bradley Manning has been in prison, mostly in solitary confinement for 22 months, a real whistleblower. Meanwhile, others who committed war crimes, like those who massacred villagers in Haditha, Iraq, are set free. Do you think that right now, in 2012, the environment is such that whistleblowers feel a greater confidence? Are they coming forward? Or is the fear being reinforced by these heavy-handed tactics by the government?
The goal of treating Bradley Manning in such an abhorrent and disgusting and despicable way is to send a chilling effect to all whistleblowers. That if you dare blow the whistle, this will be your lot. This is what will happen to you. I mean, I was fired. I mean, even though I was victorious, I got a law passed. You know, I've done. You know, I wrote a book, but I was still fired.
Right.
Right. And so every 2 years, federal employees are taking no fear courses inside the federal government. All however million people, but they must know that the woman who was able to usher through the No Fear Act was
still
fired.
lost her job.
Exactly. So that's the chilling effect that the government, I think, almost has to send, because we are a threat. I mean, you can't look at whistleblowers without understanding that when you have truth tellers in an environment of corruption, that has to threaten someone. And so the goal and the reason why we talk about no fear is because despite all this threat, despite all the intimidation, we all have to get to a place of no fear, where what we're doing is so important. I mean, Dr. King said it best, I fear no man tonight because I've seen the mountaintop, and we will get there.
And one of those inspiring speeches, and even though he was assassinated, I think the next day, that just resonates with people everywhere who are trying to stand up. Marsha Coleman-Adeayo, I want to thank you. I want to hold up your book again. I want to tell people to buy this book. It's No Fear, a whistleblower's triumph over corruption and retaliation in the EPA, but a struggle that continues.
Yes.
Thank
they can
you
buy
very
it
much.
at Amazon.com.
Amazon.com. Thank you very much.
Thank you.